Hello, folks. Welcome back. Thanks for sticking with us this afternoon. I hope you've got some good coffee with you. This chat is going to be really, really great. I am joined, folks can see now, Dr. Richard Denning has popped in from some sort of medieval battlefield.
Yes, I'm fully armed. I've even got my sword ready.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
If we need it.
I don't think we have that kind of people on our Twitch. Everybody's lovely. We don't need to get the band sword out. No, I think we're fine. But yeah, Richard's joined us here because we're talking to Jonathan, who has got the Heorot RPG Kickstarter going. And
hello.
I don't know if folks know, Richard, before we dive in and find out, why are you so excited about this? Why have you come and joined us?
I really got into the whole Anglo-Saxon and period and this sort of period way back when I was 30-ish or something like that, doing medicine, general practice courses where I come from, retired about 3 years ago. But I got into it as just a thing to do, as a spare time interest. Started reading around about it and realised actually there wasn't an awful lot that actually had been written in terms of fiction that time period. You know, we go back 20 years now. So Bernard Cornwell is a famous author that's written a lot in this period now, but it wasn't much around 20 years ago. So I started researching it and collecting these bits and bobs, which I'd taken to schools sometimes and history societies and give little talks and things. And then I got to the stage of thinking, well, you know, I'll have a bit of a bash at doing a bit of writing myself. Self-published and things, but just as a fun thing to do, and it sort of went from there. Now I think I'm on to the 5th one in the series and working on the 6th, so it's just
wow,
entertaining time period. So and then when I found out that there was a adventure book and a role-playing game based around this era, the sort of Beowulf era, well, it was I was suddenly very interested in talking about it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm the uneducated layperson here. I know my RPGs and adventure books and that kind of stuff, but in terms of like the details and the nitty gritty, I'm here for cool art and pretty words. Is my thing. So it's great to have Richard here to sort of hone in on some of the cool things that is included in it. So Jonathan. Richard, take it away, folks.
Yes.
Sure. Yeah. Well, let's start at the beginning of things. So we're going to talk today about Beowulf. We're going to talk about Heorot, the role-playing game, all from the same era, inspired by the Beowulf book. We'll get into the Beowulf book and the role-playing game and even the adventure book a bit in a little while. I just wanted to start right at the beginning, and now I'm talking about your beginnings, as it were, Jonathan. There we go. Right. I was reading. I've been playing the Beowulf adventure story and getting beaten up by Grendel and Grendel's mum and things, and the sea monsters and all that. But right at the beginning, there's a foreword, a sort of dedication, which you put into your own mother.
Yes.
Mentions some inspirations really to this whole era. So I just wanted to dig into that. I mean, what is it about, sort of fantasy and mythology and monsters and things that are of interest to you? Where does that come from?
I've just always loved anything to do with monsters. Where that comes from, I'm really not sure. I remember as a child being inspired by particular books. I mentioned in the dedication Kerry Miller's Dictionary of Monsters and Mysterious Beasts, but also I remember there being a series of programs, I think about myths and legends with David Attenborough. I might be misremembering, but they kind of each week focused on some different era. And I really remember the one about ancient Egypt and was just blown away by that. But I know they covered other things, and I had a book from the series, I think. But also I love the Usborne guides that they did to the mysterious world about ghosts and UFOs, and there's a whole book on monsters which includes things like the Loch Ness Monster, but also Grendel from the Beowulf legend. So it's just always been there, and I think if I had the choice to read about anything, it would be about monsters.
Did that extend to reading in terms of fiction as well? The people had written?
Yes. So I mean, as a child, obviously all sorts of anything with monsters, but particularly the fighting fantasy game books. They were just full of the things, and some were borrowed possibly from other existing role-playing games, were inspired by them, and others were very blatantly taken from myths and legends and folklore. Yes. And that's something I've done myself with my own stories. But yes, I've always gravitated towards the fantastical when it comes to reading, but equally old things, particularly legends about or folklores and folkloric behavior and patterns, have always fascinated me.
I must admit, sometimes
because I always think that although lots of things have been sorry, I say lots of things have been possibly dismissed or solved by modern science, and yet people believe these things for a lot longer than they haven't, and some people
Yes.
still do. There seems to be an increased interest in things like witchcraft and Wicca, and just in folklore in general.
Well, there's something about it in human nature, isn't it, that sort of finds these things fascinating. And certainly, if you've ever gone to places like Loch Ness and those sorts of locations, there's something about it where you're looking at the water and seeing the ripples and thinking, well, you might be in there. I've actually been on a boat on Loch Ness once doing Nessie hunting. There's a chap that does it, takes you out, he's got a boat with a radar, and you go out and look for the Loch Ness monster. And he's been doing that for 30 years. He's got a career out of it anyway, even if the monster doesn't exist. So monsters are, and actually, the interesting thing is, they say it's one of those big themes in all of fiction, is the monster. You know, the man against the monster. It's Jaws is basically man against the monster, isn't it?
And you think so many TV shows, things like X-Files, but science fiction things as well. There's always the Monster of the Week episode. It's always, and Doctor Who, obviously, which again was a huge part of my childhood and has been part of my life ever since.
I mean, do you tend to find you prefer the escapist sort of stuff as opposed to real life stuff?
Yes, completely. My wife's the absolute opposite. She'd much rather read biographies or real world set stories, should we say. And I enjoy dramas and things like that on TV, but there are so many books to read, and I'd much rather read something completely escapist and fantastical, except of course that also reflects on our human condition.
I remember and actually that's the point, isn't it? Because it's mythology and fantasy and science fiction doesn't mean that it can't focus on. That's what they said about Star Trek when it came along. Was because there was always some element of the human condition that was in there. Yes, you were fighting the Klingons or whatever it was in the war. The engines cannot take it, Captain. But there was always something about humanity in there as well. And
I think struggling against monsters, it kind of externalizes possibly internal issues. So although, as you say, it's the struggle, it can be the struggle against the self. But by having some hideous monster, kind of separates the two, so it's easier to process and deal with.
I remember when I was doing the day job, as it were, in the general practice, and I come home at night, and people would say, "Oh, did you see this soap or that soap or the other soap?" And so, no, I don't watch any of that stuff. I go, well, why not? So because the last thing I want to do is to watch a gritty documentary or something about drugs being taken in inner city Birmingham.
Yes.
Now, if it's a monster attacking someone in inner city Birmingham, then that's more like it.
Then you're there.
Okay, well, let's move on from there a little bit. So that's your sort of inspirations and where you sort of came from. Now you're a teacher, or were a teacher, or I think a deputy head.
I was a long time ago. Yes, I still actually have a part-time job as a school librarian, but I'm on furlough at the moment. So, I keep a hand in, but without having all the marking.
Okay, what subject did you teach?
I was primary school teacher. So technically, I'm a trained art teacher, but I've taught English, I've taught humanities, RS, all sorts of things really.
Okay.
In the time,
So where did the writing start?
So the writing started before the teaching. So when the first Fighting Fancy books were published, I became obsessed, would be the term, and started writing my own pastiches. And most of them weren't finished, or they're very short, and I draw little pictures, but they gradually got longer and longer, and the pictures fewer and fewer. So in the end, I was sort of writing about 200 section game books, which a typical Fighting Fancy one is 400. So then, when I left school, I'd already I knew I wanted to be a writer. I'd wanted to be a writer since I was about 6 years old. But no, perceived understanding was you can't make a living as a writer, so you need to do something else. So I thought, well, I was fortunate in that I enjoyed school, particularly primary school, so I became a primary school teacher. But when I left school in my A-levels, waiting to find out how I got on before I went to uni, I had my first properly writing a book to get published for the Fighting Fantasy series. And at the end of my second year at uni, I got my first commission. So my summer holiday job, other people went to work in places like Marks and Spencer's or the local corner shop, and I wrote a book each summer.
Excellent.
Nice.
Can't complain about that. So, I mean, I was looking at the whole list of all the titles, and they are pretty impressive. And obviously, there's a whole chunk of all the Fighting Fantasy things, which you'll come back to in a moment. But also Black Library books. I think you've written some 40k.
Yes.
Books. Pax Britannia.
Yeah, and Warhammer.
Pax Britannia, which I think is pulp fiction.
Yeah, that's my
Victoriana type era.
Steampunk.
Yeah. Okay.
Specifically steampunk.
Nice.
Okay. Robin Hood in novelisation I came across as well.
Yes,
Robin
yes.
Sherwood, I think.
That
So
was something I never thought I'd get to do. So
no. So that's pretty cool. And Sonic the Hedgehog, was that right? Something about game.
yeah,
game.
that's right.
And of course, non-fiction
Yeah,
books.
that was about. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Not many, but
yeah. So what was the Sonic the Hedgehog you were about to say?
So yeah, that was about 25 years ago when I first left uni, because that was the thing. Having got published, I then wanted to prove myself that I could do this, and rather than live at home, I moved to Nottingham, because that's where Games Workshop were based, and it was also where Mark Gascoigne was based, and he was the consultant editor on Fighting Fantasy at the time. So he and I ended up collaborating on 2 Sonic the Hedgehog game books.
Excellent. So are you good at it as a game?
Oh, I've played it barely twice, I think, probably.
Okay.
But it was all about the setting and the world that had been developed beyond it with the characters.
Kind of background and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, I mean, I mentioned that the Fighting Fantasy, though, you've done a lot of Fighting Fantasy books and also a history of them.
Yes.
That's the non-fiction thing that I was going to get onto. And what I found interesting was I was doing a bit of research into your Fighting Fantasy books, and so there's a lot of people saying, "Oh, they're really difficult. It's the most difficult ever." And there's one stat somewhere about only 8% people finish this particular one.
Wow.
Yeah.
So do you like making them difficult, or is that just what happened?
Well, I would say there are really 2 people called Jonathan Green who've written Fighting Fantasy game books.
All right, yeah.
So there was the one who was in his early to mid 20s, who had loved reading the books as a child, but didn't bother to roll the dice anymore, so cheated.
Okay.
And then this author came along and thought, I need to write books that will beat the people like me who cheat. But as a result, made them incredibly hard. They were, if you did want to fight the monsters, it was unfair and unbalanced. But also, playtesting wasn't what it is now. So if you miss something, being the writer, it's like you're too close to it to see the problems. And there are a couple where there are things where, for example, you have to fail a dice roll to find some vital bit of information, which is obviously not ideal. So then, having discovered the internet, so I effectively, Fighting Fantasy had finished in 1995, and my Curse of the Mummy, my 3rd published book, was the last one in the series. Then it was about a year later, maybe 2 years later, I discovered the internet, and I discovered all these rumors about the books, and also people who analyzed them in far greater mathematical detail than I ever had, and discovered all these problems. And I thought, okay, this isn't great. So then when I had the opportunity to start writing them again, I then wrote them with a slightly more mature head, thinking, well, people want to cheat. It's because they like the story. Let them cheat. You need to write it and make it fair for those people who want to play it fairly.
Yes.
So as a result, the later ones are actually a lot fairer, particularly Howl of the Werewolf and Night of the Necromancer. People have noticed that, which is nice.
Okay, that's great. I mean, I remember when they republished them all. That was something that was done amongst other places. We got some of the exclusive releases and things, and Ian and Steve came along to the expo and things, and that was really, really great. And seeing all that again, because how old was I? I might have been 16 or something when I picked up the Warlock of Firetop Mountain. And Tony, the other director of the expo, talks a lot about having got into the entire gaming hobby by picking up Warlock of Firetop Mountain, in the back of which there was an advert for Dungeons and Dragons, which he then picked up.
I think a lot of people did.
Yeah. No, it was it's important.
Yeah, I think a lot of people did, and I also got into D&D at the same time. And a friend of mine had all sorts of. I had the basic red box. Sorry, I think there's a. I was just saying that I had the D&D red box, and my friend then went on and got the expert set, the companion set, and just spend on coach trips for some reason. I remember this, but poring over the monster manuals and just loving reading all the stats and the descriptions and the illustrations as much as anything else.
Yes, and if you like to GM things, those are the fun bits, aren't they? Trying to find the different sort of monsters that do the different things and stuff that are going to create a bit of a challenge for the players. And never mind if the monster finally gets defeated, but it's good if they've had to think a bit to work around a particular problem that's causing them. But yes, okay. So very, very important. I think the fighting fantasy for the whole inspiration of quite a few people. And I remember when we had it, when we had them at
Definitely.
the expo, the queues of people coming with their old copies to get to get them signed and things was.
Yeah, and I've noticed that as well. And often
yeah.
it's the designers from other stalls who then get very excited to get 5-minute break to go and meet Steve or Ian or both of them.
Yeah.
And all sorts of people have credited them. I've forgotten his name now, but the designer of Dark Souls has said that he was a fan of fighting fantasy during the day, back in the day. Yeah, and all sorts of games designers have got there's some link with it in their past.
Okay, so fighting fantasy, I think, is quite important, not just because you wrote those particular series yourself, because you've done a lot of your own choose your own adventure stories. And now we're moving on to things in which include Beowulf, but there's a whole series of them, aren't there? There was a Neverland one, Alice in Wonderland inspired one, and I think a Wizard of Oz, a Wicked Wizard of Oz, and a few others. Lion the Witch and the Wardrobe, Narnia and things. And what's I think quite cool about this idea, and it's one of those things you think, I wish I'd thought about that, because taking an existing story and then making it a choose your own adventure story, that's quite a clever little twist. I don't think I've actually come across it much before. People have written choose your own adventure stories, but I've not seen many where they've taken a existing story and done that. So where did the idea for that come from?
It was complete accident in that when it came up to the 125th anniversary of the publication of Alice in Wonderland, I thought I'd like to turn this into a game book and give it a go, because I'd already used the story as inspiration for a Pax Britannia short story and thought I could do more with this. So I thought 125th anniversary is a good time to do it, crowdfund it through Kickstarter. So it was never meant to be a series, which is why that first one originally didn't have Ace Gamebooks mentioned in it at all. But then having done it, so I pillaged all sorts of Lewis Carroll material. So as well as Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, you've also got Through the Looking Glass and what Alice found there in there. There's also The Hunting of the Snark. So when it was published, people said, "Oh, you're going to do a sequel based on Through the Looking Glass?" And I was like, "Well, that's already in the first book, and I've done Alice now. I want to do something different." But then I thought, well, what else could I do? And I think possibly it's partly inspired by the teaching I was doing at the time. I'd actually read The Wizard of Oz for the first time. I'd never read it before. I'd only sort of seen the film or bits of the film. And I read it to a class of children and realized how little of it actually appears in the film and how different it is, and how I enjoyed it far more than I've enjoyed the film. So I thought, well, I could do a similar thing with this, but make it slightly different. So rather than I went steampunk with Alice, I then went diesel punk with The Wicked Wizard of Oz. And then I think possibly because Alan Moore wrote the Lost Girls book, I think he included then, so he'd had Alice and Dorothy, and he also had, name suddenly escaped me, from, I should know this, Wendy from Peter Pan. So I then thought, well, I'll do Peter Pan, but I thought I really don't like Peter Pan. It's really twee, in my opinion. But I could merge it with something that I'd find much more interesting. And I thought, what if Neverland was also Skull Island from King Kong? So you've then got Peter Pan versus dinosaurs, which was a lot of fun to write, and it became quite unwieldy. So having started off as well with Alice, where it was you can just guide on a future. For the second one, I thought, well, you can play as the different characters from the book. And I then continued this as a theme. So in Neverland, Here Be Monsters, you can play as Peter Pan, Wendy, but you can also play as Tiger Lily. And I was really pleased with her because she's a bit of a non-character in the original book. But in this one, she starts off riding a saber-toothed tiger and is the only character who can fight dinosaurs from the get-go. And then I also had Captain Hook, so you can play as the villain. And all of the stories intertwine. So they might start slightly different points in the timeline. But for example, if you play Peter and you fight Captain Hook, because one of the bits I included in the book, you know that Hook's hand was chopped off by Peter, but it's all done off stage. Well, in the modern novel, that would be front and center. So in my book, you actually have the battle where Peter chops off Hook's hand. So if you then play as Hook, you'll have that encounter from his point of view. So equally, Hook can win, which is quite fun.
That's good. That's actually quite clever, because being able to entwine several different storylines like that is quite difficult, isn't it? I would have thought, to manage to get it to all work.
Yes, I mean that's why Alice was 520 sections long, which is already longer than a typical fighting fantasy book. Oz, because I had 6 playable characters and 850, and Neverland took it up to 900 because of making everything work. And I'm not sure I've ever said this publicly anywhere, but anybody who's got the book, there is, if you can find a copy of the map, which does exist online, but it's also in the hardback, there are some, well, runes or pictograms around the edge of the picture, which you can translate, and they give you the clue that you can fight, you can actually play through the adventure as the crocodile as well.
Wow.
Excellent. Brilliant. Okay, so
Cool.
It's the only one where when the other characters meet dinosaurs, they're always described rather than, because I thought the only person who possibly know that they were dinosaurs, Indy, from the setting, because she starts off on the Titanic. But anybody else, they wouldn't know that they're called Tyrannosaurus Rex. So the dinosaurs don't have those names. They're called things like Tyrant Lizard, except if you play as the crocodile, you're actually a Deinosuchus, and it's the only time that your enemies are referred to by their scientific classifications. So you get to fight mosasaurs and things like that.
That's wicked.
excellent. Yeah, so I mean, the one thing I've been, as I say, I've been having a go at the Beowulf adventure, choose your own adventure thing. So what's I think quite good about this is that the Beowulf, if you go back to the original, the translations of Beowulf, obviously it's in Old English, we'll come to this in a minute, but if you go into any of the translations, they're all fairly archaic writings, aren't they? That take a bit of reading.
Yes.
You have to
Yes.
something you can just read in modern English. It's archaic English sort of thing, really, and you've managed to sort of do the make it come through in that kind of high heroic style, as it were. But modernise it a bit, so it's a bit easier to read than the original Beowulf, which I think works pretty well. It's been fun so far. So I don't know if I'm going to get if I'll survive to the end, if the 8% applies to this story or not, but whether I've got a better chance. But it's good stuff. But that brings us.
Oh no! My Ace Game books are much fairer. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, all right. I might have a 50-50 chance then. No, but the Beowulf, obviously central to that and to the role-playing game, which we'll come on to in a moment. And I think sometimes people might not necessarily know quite how significant Beowulf is as an inspiration for an awful lot of what we play in terms of role-playing games and fantasy and everything, really. And in fact, it's remarkable the thing that survives in the first place. The one document, if people didn't know this, of written in Old English, 8th century, one document survives through into the medieval period, found in some monastery somewhere, eventually becomes part of a museum which burns down, burning the edges of it. It's taken into the British Library Museum, but they don't look after it particularly well. It crumbles away. A Danish chap, because of course it's set in Denmark, comes along and actually does a whole transcription of this, takes it back to Copenhagen, writes a full like a translation of it and the whole thing, and then his house burns down. So that all gets lost. He then spends 7 years rewriting the whole thing, and that's then released, from which finally the British Museum wake up and say, this is actually quite significant, this, maybe we should actually look after the thing. And then finally we get English translations, which folk like Tolkien study. And when you're reading it, and people don't necessarily know this, that there's actually only 2 dragons mentioned in most of Viking and Anglo-Saxon mythology, one of which is mentioned in Beowulf. And this particular dragon, happens to have an underground chamber full of treasure, which the hero has to go into and kill the dragon, and finally there's the treasure and stuff. And a lot of the description of this dragon sounds very much like Smaug when you read it. And so yes. Tolkien was obviously all over Beowulf. He wrote a translation of it. He lectured on it, and it's not surprising when we get the Lord of the Rings. There's a lot of that in there, and they have the Hobbit. So, and if we didn't have Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, would we have role-playing games?
That's a good question. Yeah,
there's a debate point for you. So a good, I think, quite an inspiration for lots of what we enjoy today. And as I say, I think you've done pretty well in making that into because if you read any of the other books, they're only 100 or a couple hundred years old, aren't they? Beowulf is 12th centuries old. and
Yes. Yeah.
to manage to take that into bring it into the modern
Yes.
world is inspired. So how then did you, set about kind of taking that story and making an adventure book out of it? How do you actually do that? How do you sit down and chunk it, split it into chunks and make that work?
Well, it's weird actually, because I say that Alice was the first one in the series. In a way, Beowulf was, because I planned to write this probably a few years before Alice, but then due to life circumstances, I ended up going back into teaching for a while and didn't have the time, and it got put on the back burner, and then other things took my interest instead. But I'd always thought it'd make a good game book. Obviously, it's tricky because people, if they've read the story, but then the way I could sort of vary things, I realized, was that there are various points in the story where people tell stories, or they refer to telling stories. So the most well-known one is that when Beowulf first arrives at Heorot, at King Hrothgar's court, he's saying about what a fantastic hero he is, and Hrothgar knew his dad, and there's always, oh, lovely to see you, and all the rest of it. And then Breca, who's one of Hrothgar's men, is quite, sorry, not Unferth, get it right. He's obviously quite put out about this, and he says, oh, but aren't you the same Beowulf who lost the swimming race to Breca? And at this point, Beowulf uses the opportunity to tell the story of the swimming race and about how they've been swimming for 7 days, and then he was attacked by a sea monster, and this is the only reason why he lost.
Yep.
So I thought what I'd do is I'd have these various points throughout the story where you effectively go back in time and you play through that story as if it's real time.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, if you die, you're not actually dead in the structure, you're telling the story, so it goes back, but it hasn't done you any favors. But if you get through to the end of that mini quest, if you like, your heroic status goes up. So I have this measured in the book by hero points. So if you do anything heroic, particularly heroic, or you tell a heroic story, you gain hero points, which you can then spend, because so many of the things which heroes like Beowulf, and if you think about it, he's possibly one of the first superheroes of English literature. He does all these completely incredible things, like wrestling a monster that's killed umpteen other men, kills the mother who kind of slaughters the whole hall's worth of warriors in one night. He takes on a dragon, and although it kills him, he kills the dragon first. So the way I measure this is because he isn't quite human. He is a hero. He's something else. He's almost like a demigod. So he spends these hero points to do these heroic feats. And then as you get into it and you look about the description of what happens in the story, there are ways you can branch it without going too far. And I did add some brand new encounters, like he meets a seeress at one point. And I brought in other things like making offerings to the different gods, which can then have an effect later on. So if you've got the blessing of Tyr, the god of war, it helps you in battle. Or if you've done something to please King Hrothgar's queen, Wealhtheow, that can help you in tricky situations as well. So it kind of started to tell itself. The trickiest bit was getting the tone right, because like you say, I wanted it to sound like it was an epic poem, although it's not written in verse at all, and equally that you could still understand it. But one of the things I did was I brought in the use of kennings quite a lot, the whole sort of poetic phrases, and quite often they're the hyphenated 2 words I put in the adventure. So they become a measure for code words. So it gives you a clue if you've done particular things. Rather than collecting lots of objects, you have these kennings, which can then open up different parts of the adventure later on, or give you advantages, or sometimes disadvantages. But equally, in the style of writing, they appear quite a lot throughout the book.
Yes, I noticed that. So you're writing these things down. So, the Blackwater or something. You found this lake that actually the Grendel's mum's underneath.
Yeah.
So actually, the fact that you found it earlier when you were pursuing Grendel is helpful, because now you know where the thing is. When you go back later, and you build up this sort of knowledge of stuff, which is then useful to. If you haven't discovered those things, then presumably it's more difficult to do things. So yeah, that's clear.
So for example, if you don't know where the lake is, you can end up going through a wood, and you maybe run into a bear instead. But by knowing where the lake is, you avoid that combat.
So you don't then take some damage on the way, sort of thing. Okay, so that was the adventure book. So now we get to the role playing game now, which is the current thing that you have on Kickstarter at the present moment. It's running for about the next month, I think. Is that right?
Yes.
And
Yeah, it's actually got 33 days left to go.
okay. And what did so obviously you've written the adventure book. So was that, did you at that time were you thinking, oh, I'm going to do a role playing game based on this as well, or was it did it come later?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, yes, that's absolutely what I thought. One of the things about Kickstarter is you want to try and give people a reason to back it rather than just wait for the book or the game to be published later on anyway. Of course, if people don't back the Kickstarter, the book won't come out. So that's one thing.
Yeah.
But I thought, well, maybe I could offer a set of simple role-playing game rules linked to this world. And I'd decided that at that point I would call it Heorot, role-playing in the world of Beowulf Beastslayer. But then I also thought, I'm going to try and write a game book already in an epic, poetic style. That's quite a challenge. To then also write a whole RPG just as an add-on, that way madness lies. So instead, we went with the little miniatures instead.
Okay.
So Otherworld Miniatures produced, Paul Muller sculpted them, but you've got Beowulf and you've also got Grendel.
Good on you.
So that became the kind of the bonus perk, the incentive for backing the Kickstarter the first time round. But it stuck with me, and I thought I would still like to do this, but give myself more time and do it really well, rather than just a basic role-playing game, make it the complete thing.
Right. Yeah.
And although that was in my mind, the first one I actually attempted was a simpler version, because the book I did after Beowulf's Beastslayer was 'Twas the Krampus Night Before Christmas. And I did a role-playing game based on that, which just happens to be on my shelf. So that came out just before Christmas last year. And it was the first time I'd sort of self-published something through Drive-Thru RPG. So having seen how it works and got a team on board, so there's Mark Stoneham does the layout, I've got Edwin Brown as a games editor, Tony Huff did the illustrations for that one. So I thought, I know what I'm doing now, so let's go back and do Heorot. And that's where we are right now. And I'm very pleased to say that in the early hours of this morning, the Kickstarter reached its funding goal.
Excellent.
So we're now heading towards the stretch goals.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So what you say it's a rules light approach, sort of like story driven and things. So what are the kind of mechanics and things that drive it?
So the mechanics are based on those which I used for the game book.
Right.
So which are similar to anybody who's played things like Lone Wolf or Fighting Fantasy, they'll be similar to those. But it goes into more detail. So you do have weapons and armor. And rather than being called hero points, you now have your weird. But it's the same idea, is that you can collect weird points, but it's going to be, rather than just points, it's a pool of dice. So when you want to perform some amazing task, you can roll from your weird pool.
Right.
Now, obviously, because you've then got a success indicator to hit, you might not make it, but then it means that your weird pool has been reduced for the next time you want to try it. So there's that element, and at the same time, the storytelling is still a huge part of the game. So there's three ways to play the game. The most simple, quick way is to just do a storytelling contest, and that's going to involve playing cards and random elements where people collect a set of cards. They then each have to tell a story based on those elements, and effectively the players vote to see who's told the best story, and they get apportioned their weird points that way. You can then introduce that into an ongoing campaign where you have, between each sort of adventure where you go out into the world, you come back to the meet, or you come back to Heorot, and you boast of your adventures, and you tell people what you've done, and as other people tell their stories, and you can kind of reinstate your weird points. But then there's also, you can play it as a more traditional RPG with pre-written adventures, which is what's also going to be in the basic book. But again, the storytelling will still help with aspects of that.
Okay, that sounds pretty good then. So you say adventures. So there are some basic adventures in the book to start with, are there, or are they more like story
in
ideas?
the book, as well as having. So well, there's going to be, because I did it with Twas. There's various adventure hooks, campaign suggestions, but there will be two specific adventures. So you have effectively a quick start set of rules, and you then get your first adventure, which is Beowulf fighting Grendel in Heorot. That's the first part of the adventure. So it's kind of Act 1. The book will then go off into more detail about the rules and various different tables and charts. And then there's a larger adventure at the back of the book, which is, so the first one's called Beastslayer, the second one's called Trollslayer, and that's where Beowulf goes off to fight Grendel's mum. It's because there's far more involved in that part of the story, because they actually have to go somewhere. They have to, or he has to fight his way to the bottom of the lake, past all sorts of water snakes, and then in the cave he fights the monster and finds a magical sword and made by giants. So that will form a bigger party adventure at the end. And then if we hit enough stretch goals, there's going to be a Geats source book, so for Beowulf's tribe from Sweden. And in that will be Act 3, which is Dragon Slayer, where he goes off to fight the dragon.
Yes.
But if we hit enough stretch goals, there'll be a completely brand new campaign called The Sons of Ragnar, which is inspired by Ivor the Boneless and the Saxon invasion of East Anglia.
Okay, all right. So that's taking the story on, because this era that Beowulf is set in is a sort of precursor or predecessor. It's a, I don't know, century or so, isn't it, prior to the Anglo-Saxon migrations and invasions, or around that time period. In fact, I think in Beowulf's story, there's a
for the setting for the.
Go ahead, yeah.
Sorry. I was just saying, for the setting for the game, it's effectively taking the era of kind of Northern Europe from the end of Roman rule in Britain through to roughly the Battle of Hastings in 1066.
All right, it's the whole
so it's
period.
quite a large period of history when all sorts of things happened. Yeah, and obviously Beowulf's the inspiration for that, but then you can tell stories from different traditions using different characters, or have completely fictional ones. It's up to you.
So Vikings and Saxons and even possibly the Normans coming and that sort of thing. Okay, that's it's quite a scope to the whole period and things. And I can't think there's been a lot of the role-playing games particularly set in that era. I mean, there's been some on more the in more the mythological worlds, you know, going out into the nine worlds and all of that sort of thing. But this one obviously set in a historical period, but with the monsters turning up. It's quite an interesting.
Yes, yeah. So it's kind of that's why I've referred to it as Midgard in the game. So it's the mythical world of Northern Europe. So it is kind of that historical time period, but equally everything that those people believed is true. So there are gods, there are monsters, there are witches, there are the Norns are following the fates of men, and things like that.
Yeah. All right, that's all pretty good then. So I mean, I think this is got a lot of potential. I'm certainly looking forward to seeing the role-playing game turn up and things. And you know, as I can say, if you like choose your own adventure stories and want a slightly different one, then the Beowulf adventure book is a good starting point, I think, to try and get into this world. Certainly give you the kind of background to it.
I should point out as well that if you've played Beowulf Beastslayer, just as if you've read the story, you'll have some clues. If you then play the RPG, there will be different bits to it, so it's not a complete rehash. So the idea is, if you played one, you can enjoy the other, and there'll be new things for you each time.
Well, as you say, it's not just the Beowulf story, is it? It's the whole era going on from there.
But also,
so on as well.
with the Beowulf story itself, of course, part of it is he's the hero, so he goes off and does everything heroic.
Yes.
But for an RPG, that's I know that Handiwork Games have done their Beowulf Age of Heroes, which is a duet RPG. So you've got your games master and one player. So I've gone the other way round. So you can also still have Beowulf's warband. And while he's doing something in one place, they'll be doing something somewhere else. So they're not sitting around waiting for him to come back. And each side of the adventure will influence the other. So just like the storytelling in the past influences how well you do in the present, something that his warband does while they're at the lake, while Beowulf's heading down to fight Grendel's mum, can give him an advantage. Equally, if he fights a particular creature or finds a treasure or something else, it will help the warband on the surface.
Okay. Also, well, pretty good.
Just sharing with some of the folks at home some of the layout, and it has got that real old school, like it's so much nostalgia and memories with the meat hall layout that you shared on the Kickstarter.
Cool.
Absolutely gorgeous.
Thank you. Well, I'm delighted because Russ Nicholson illustrated Beowulf Beastslayer, and of course he illustrated the first Fighting Fantasy game book The Warlock of Fartup Mountain. He also illustrated Fiend Folio, Fabled Lands, all sorts of things. So he's a complete legend. But I should just point out, I'm really thrilled because John Howe is also providing illustrations. And in case you don't know, he's the guy who paints all the Tolkien pictures, and he was the conceptual designer for the Lord of the Rings films and The Hobbit. And he's illustrating my RPG. So that was,
Wow.
I have to boast about that one myself.
No, that's a great thing to boast about. It's exploding brains at the kind of like, that's amazing.
But it's also nice because normally I have just one artist for a project. I have a particular look, but this time, because there's so many different elements to the art, there's also Katie Wakelin doing the kind of woodcut images which appear as the chapter headings, and she'll do some more of those and hopefully do some link to myths. I've got LA, who's the guy who's done the cover art. He's a Nigerian artist, and he's done fantastic full wraparound cover for the book. And if we hit the stretch goals, he'll be doing the covers for those as well. And I've also got Kev Crossley, who's collaborated with me on some other of my Ace game books. He's going to do a fantastically intricate drawing of Yggdrasil, the World Tree.
Wow.
It's an amazing team.
This definitely is an amazing team. Just looking at some of their pictures and their stuff on your Kickstarter now, it's pretty amazing. I'm excited.
So when do you expect the this to come to fruition, as it were, when we get our hands on a book?
So the Kickstarter ends at the end of March. It's the longest one I've done because the idea is, I think, a bit of a drip feed, particularly of an RPG, pick up a few people along the way. And it's like I say, we're halfway through and it's funded, so that's great. I've said it'll be March next year, but of course, if it's done earlier than that, people will get it sooner than that.
Okay.
But I think better to under promise and over deliver.
Yes, that's certainly the case. Anyway, thanks for coming on, and I think I've certainly enjoyed talking about that, and I'm quite interested in having a look at that when it comes out. And I shall see if I can get through the Beowulf adventure book before then.
Yeah,
Survive.
Well, looking forward to bringing it to the UK Games Expo at some point as well.
Yes, I suppose I was. In fact, I sort of hijacked things for a couple of minutes there, Mel, just to say that we had this announcement this week about the roadmap in the UK, and we are getting emails and questions and things, obviously, as you would expect, about what does that mean. And I wish I knew.
Yeah.
I mean, the short answer is, in theory, if everything was to go absolutely hunky-dory and according to plan, then we may be in a position where we can do a show at the end of July fairly close to normal, But, of course, there's an awful lot of caveats and things to throw into this, aren't there? First of all, they've deliberately said that large events is an area they're looking at along the side of all of this, so we're going to wait for that to happen. They're going to do some trials in April and things. They're also talking about maybe reduced attendance capacity numbers and things, so we need to wait for that to come out. And if there's slippage at any point along the way, we're only 5 weeks after that 21st of June date, so it's when that came out on Monday, and I was actually at the office on rare occasions. Just occasionally we go in and do a bit of work where it's around a table is helpful. Mostly we've been doing it, remotely, and we all stared at each other and thought, what does that mean then? So I think where we are with things at the moment is we are hoping something's possible. We've got to keep a close eye on all of the plans, all the news and everything as it happens, particularly the days. Do we hit the 29th of March? Do we hit the 12th of April or 15th?
Yeah,
those things happen on time, and you start to think, okay, and if the vaccinations are on time and all this sort of stuff, then you start to get a bit more confident that by the end of July something's possible. Whether that's a reduced capacity, smaller attendance type of thing, as yet to be seen. And I think we'll just have to tell people things as and when we find out. And they keep saying, what about going later in the year? Well, at the moment we haven't got an alternate date line. If one came up that the NEC had, we would consider it, but we haven't got that on the table at the moment, so it's not a question we can answer. So hopefully in about 6 to 8 weeks' time, we'll start to get a better idea about possibilities. Let's cross fingers and hope something's possible.
Yeah. But
so it'd be great to see this at the show, indeed. Yes.
Yeah, but in the meantime, we're on Kickstarter till the end of March, you said?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's quite easy to find. We've put a couple of links in the chat, and we've had a look, so we know what we were spotting when we do hit the Kickstarter search. It looks really exciting. And it's been great to have you here, Richard, to help us navigate through, because I would never have known how many times the poor Beowulf saga had burnt to bits before we'd actually gotten it. That's a crazy story. That's awesome. We'll be back next week with more lunchtime chats with some wonderful folks. And like Richard said, come and find us on social medias. That's where we'll post when we know, we'll let you know. And it will be through the social medias. Thank you for joining us, Jonathan. Thank you for joining us in chat today, folks. Have a great afternoon. We will see you soon.
Right.
Bye.